I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Today is Monday, April 24th, 2023. And we've got a great program. As I always say, we're going to be bringing what I call robust conversation. Today, I'm talking with two friends, one of my colleagues, Dr. Irma McClaurin, who's the Education and Culture editor for Insight News, who is a world-renowned anthropologist and educator and civic leader and artist, poet, published, is here with a person that she's connected me to, and that's Brother Amilcar Priestley, who has the Afro-Latino Project. We're talking about the question of Afro-Latino identity. Before we start, two things. One is thank you for checking out the program. Call somebody up and let them know that we're on the air right now and they should join this conversation. They can catch us on the Black Press USA YouTube channel or the Insight News YouTube channel. We're also streaming live to Black Press USA Facebook and to Insight News Facebook. We're streaming live to Twitter and to LinkedIn as well. No matter where you are, I still need your help in something. The help I need is that you, in the course of the day or the program, get over to the Insight News YouTube channel and become a subscriber. We're trying to build our subscriber base. We do that one subscriber at a time. Hopefully, you'll say that it's your time right now, and you'll go to YouTube Insight News channel and subscribe. And we thank you in advance. Tell everybody you know. We do this every day, 5 days a week. And again, robust conversation. Well, we start with what we call hot topics. And today here in Minnesota, one of the big news items is that the police officer that killed Daunte Wright in 2021 was released from prison early this morning. Looking at a story from the Associated Press that says that Kim Potter, the Minneapolis police officer who mistook her gun for a taser and killed Daunte Wright in 2021, was released from prison early Monday. The Minnesota Department of Corrections said Porter was set free at around 4 a.m., quote unquote, out of abundance of caution. So I guess, before protesters could arrive or whatever. The department confirmed Friday that she'd be released on Monday, but declined to say what time out of security concerns. Potter, it says, it describes as a white officer for a suburban Minneapolis department, fatally shot Wright, 20, who was black, during a traffic stop in April 2021. And the shooting happened right during the trial of Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd, and Wright's death also set off several days of protest. Well, and in light of this, in the light of the last week, all of the shootings, I think there's a lot to talk about. I'll ask my guests to, over the course of the conversation, weigh in on that. Irma, let me bring you in first just to react to, number one, what are the optics around the release of Kim Potter, serving 16 months on a 2-year sentence? The requirement is that the person served 2/3 of the sentence. 16 months would be that. She's out today. Any sense of the public sentiment in our community about Kim Potter's sentencing and release?
Well, I think people are outraged because primarily the way that it was presented to us is that her health has deteriorated, and so we should be compassionate. But where's the compassion for the young men who are incarcerated at very young ages? Where's the compassion for them? Where's the compassion for the family who lost someone because of what was really a professional error? I mean, who mistakes a taser, a pistol, for a taser? Either the person wasn't well trained, and they should pay for what happened. And I think the main thing is that this is all built around how whiteness. This is another example of white fragility. We're supposed to feel empathy for her. We're supposed to feel sorry for her, but we don't expand those same kinds of feelings and sentiments if the perpetrator is Black or Latino or Indigenous. We don't. And so there's a sense that the injustice continues. It's almost like a slap in the face.
Okay, well, thank you, Irma. Let's move from there. And maybe Brother Amilcar wants to comment on that. If you do, I'll have you do that in the course of the conversation. I want to bring you in, though, Amilcar Priestley, to talk about your work with the Afro-Latino Project. And it should be on Inside News' webpage now. If it's not, it'll be there shortly. But also in the next edition of Inside News, an essay you wrote, the essay entitled U.S. Census, Hispanic Race Change Debacle, a reversal of 10 years of progress for U.S. Black Latinos, Latinxs. And so we are running that, the English version that you wrote, but we're also running a version of it written in Portuguese and Spanish, in Yoruba, in Swahili, and in French. The idea is that our section that we call Afro-descendant is intentional in elevating our presence through a variety, are reflected in a variety of the idioms that we engage in speaking and learning and being. And so it's critically important to elevate the question of Black Latino, Latinxs. And let me just invite you, welcome you here, and have you first talk about, your work at the Afro-Latino Project, and then get into what the issue of the day is in terms of the census. Good afternoon, brother.
Hi, yes, good afternoon, Al. Hi, Irma, good afternoon.
I hope we lost them real quick.
Well, while we're waiting for Amilcar to come on, what I can do is tell you a little bit about the Afro-Latino Project. I sit on the board, and I'm proud to say that it was one of the grants that I funded to his father, the late Dr. George Priestley, who was the director of Latin America and Puerto Rican studies at Queens College for over 35 years. And Dr. Priestley was someone who was a political scientist. He wrote in both English and Spanish. He wrote academic work, but he also wrote in Spanish about issues in Panama. So the origins of Amilcar is Afro-Latino, he's an Afro-Panamanian. And the purpose of the project originally was to do research around HIV/AIDS work and to just bring together a collaboration. And this is almost 2005. So we're talking almost 10, 15 years ago, at a moment in time when nobody in Latin American studies was paying attention to African descendant days. They didn't. And so when I funded that project, it was the beginning of a wave of institutions beginning to recognize that people of African descent from Latin America really had a culture. They had their own history of progress and resistance. They were descendants of slaves in Panama specifically. They are the descendants of West Indian laborers and African slaves, West Indian laborers who were brought to Panama to build the canal. And so the first generation of which the late George Priestley was, the parents were primarily English speaking. He was bilingual, and by the second and third generation, they're completely fluent in Spanish. So when we meet Black people from Latin America and we wonder, like, why are they speaking Spanish? It's their language. It is their national identity. And I think we have to understand that the racialization process, even though they're people of African descent, happened differently in Latin America than it did in the United States. And so I think we need to take that into account, that we can't ask them to mirror our progress or our struggles, but we need to recognize that they have their own progress and their own struggles, and that when people from Latin America, particularly those who consider themselves white or who designate Hispanic white on the census, when they come to this country, they come with an overlay of racialization, a system that is what is called blanqueamiento, which is whitening up. And so the enterprise in Latin America, instead of one drop makes you Black, it is the more you mix white in, the less Black you become. And that's really the agenda. And so I think it's a very different process. And I wrote about that in my article that
Mhm.
was appeared, I think, in the March 28 issue. Let me look at it. I have it here. So yes, so that March 26.
Yeah.
So that one said, Hispanics, Latinos beware, becoming a race is not all that. And it's really a warning that this process of trying to create this new category really is problematic.
I have a personal stake in this. My story, my family story is that while my grandfather and grandmother immigrated from Jamaica to Cuba to work at the turn of the century, early 1900, some of his brothers and cousins immigrated to Panama. So a
Mhm.
lot of our own personal family members have the same Panama story. Some have the Cuban story. And there is the connection out of our Jamaican and therefore African roots. I think Amilcar is back. When we bring
Yes.
him back on, Brother Amilcar, again, thank you. Let's talk about the work, in your words, of the project under your leadership, stewardship, and then bring that into the point of today's discussion, the census, and what's at stake. What's the
Yeah.
identity question that we have to raise, and what identity preserving solutions are you recommending that we look at, think about, debate, pursue?
Sure. Thank you. And apologies. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. So, again, my name is Amilcar Priestley. I'm the serve as the director of the AfroLatino Project. The project was it's an organization that was founded back in 2006 by my father, George Priestley, who was an activist, an academic, who was heavily involved in the Black Latino movement, both here in the U.S. as well as in Panama, where we're from. And the project has taken many kind of amalgamations. It initially started examining ways in which, and that's kind of a continuous process, ways in which Afro Latinos can serve as bridges within U.S. society amongst different races and ethnicities. A few years after that, we worked on um, a stigmatization project where we analyzed HIV/AIDS stigmatization amongst Black Latinos in the U.S., Honduras, amongst Black communities in the U.S., Honduras, and Dominican Republic and Panama. And then around 2011, after my father passed away, we we took a pause, and we decided that we were going to come back, um, and we wanted to focus our attention. This was around 2010 on the digital space, social media, and these things were kind of just emerging, and we felt it was an opportunity to use digital tools, mobile technology, to capture the narratives of our communities. And so we started a digital oral history project called Conversemos Afro. That progressed. We started to use WhatsApp. This was in the early days of WhatsApp, to record oral histories, and we hosted several workshops. Around 2012, my wife started the Afro-Latino Festival, and the project kind of took a turn in supporting the not just the oral histories, but also because what those led to was an understanding that a lot of our cultural heritage was not being preserved. And so we took it upon ourselves to support the work of the Afro-Latino Festival, which last year celebrated 10 years. And the Afro-Latino Festival is the largest Afro-Latino produced event festival in the United States of its kind. So we're very proud of that. And all of that has kind of been part of this trajectory. And I guess that this is a good way to segue into the kind of subject matter at hand. But all of that has been a part of a trajectory, not just with us, but with the community in the United States as well as regionally. Momentum that had been built from 2000, the International Conference Against Racism, Discrimination, and Xenophobia in Durban, South Africa. And then in 2011, when the UN declared the International Year for People of African Descent. And there's been a lot of momentum since then. It's always a work in progress. Where there are gains, there are losses, but we move forward. In recent years, we had Epsy Campbell, who was elected as vice president in Costa Rica. Most recently, we had Francia Marquez Mina elected as vice president in Colombia. We have the reemergence of President Lula in Brazil, who has appointed a number of high-profile Afro-descendants to important positions. Most recently, just last week in Panama, the National Secretary for the Advancement of Afro-Panamanians and for the Development of Afro-Panamanians, they gained through a legislative decree their autonomy. So they are now no longer under a ministry, formerly the Ministry of Culture. They are now their own autonomous entity, and from which they can set their own agenda, which is a huge win, very important. It's something that's been working on for at least 10 years, if not longer, and it came from at the hands of the work of many people, many activists. And so when we see all of these things, we turn then to what's going on in the United States with the U.S. Census proposal currently at hand. And what that is that the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, which sets the race and ethnicity standards in the United States, they have been undergoing a review of how to define race and ethnicity, and what they've come up with, and they've done tests over the recent years. They've come up with a proposal to combine the race and ethnicity question. So right now, if you just took the census in 2020, the question is, are you Hispanic or not? Question one. And then what is your race? And it asks you if you're white, black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, and a number of other categories. There are 4 or 5 minimum categories. And the proposal currently at hand conflates the categories, the questions, right? So it asks, what is your race or ethnicity? And it asks, are you black, Latino? Are you black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander? And it also adds a MENA category. So there are a number of proposals. Let me back up a little bit. There's a number of proposals at hand. The one is the conflation of this category from 1 to 2, from 2 to 1 question. It's also the creation of a MENA category, the Middle East North African, and that is in an effort, after hearing from feedback from the Middle East and North African community, to disaggregate from the to have them seen and disaggregated from the white category. And one of the other proposals is currently under discussion. It's not under formal consideration, but under discussion is the creation of an ADOS FBA category as well. American descendants of slaves, or a foundational Black American category. There's a number of terms that are being discussed, I think, within the ADOS and FBA community, but that have been presented, our understanding, with regards to the census. But so all of these things are up for proposal. With respect to the Latino question, our concern, and our concern, the Afro-Latino Project, and we are part of a coalition of Afro-Latino organizations in the U.S. That have formed in in alarm and in opposition to the proposed changes. The concern is that whereas the one generally thinks of a move to disaggregation of data to get more granular, this in essence aggregates data, right? And so we lose the granularity of data, specifically as it affects Black people who also identify as Hispanic or Latino.
That means the change proposed gives you a choice of being either or, not both, right? Or not.
So that's an interesting question. So supposedly it allows you to choose both. But the question then becomes, so then are you now considered multiracial? There's a whole host of coding that goes on with respect to the census. And so there's a lack of clarity as to how that is going to ultimately be considered and how people are going to be coded. So I, for example, would put myself as Black and Latino. Does that mean I am now considered multiracial? Right? Because what this is, in a sense, they have said that this is not the creation of a racial category, right? And they've said that repeatedly in the documentation and explanations and presentations and great. However, in effect, that is what happens, right? And it creates this default that, as we know, OMB and census creates are the kind of floor for data in the United States. And so once they adopt this as the default, irrespective, because apparently there are entities and agencies that already use this kind of combined question and already kind of invisibilize Afro-Latinos. But this just validates what they are doing, which from our perspective should not be, because we lose, again, ourselves in the data. And so there's a lot of concern about that. And there's a number of other concerns with respect to the design of the questions, with respect to the testing that's been conducted. A lot of so the crux of the concern has been that Latinos have chosen some other race in large numbers. About 40% of Latinos have chosen some other race when they are selecting on the census, and predominantly when they choose that, they choose right in their country. Interestingly enough, census says it can't code that, right? It has a whole bunch of other codes of over 200 that they use to come up with how people categorize themselves when it's not clear. So they say that they can't code that. However, what's interesting is that on the census currently in the proposed form, it has race, and in an effort to get more data, the census tried to add additional detail. They put in under race country identifiers, so people can identify by country, but all of the countries that are under the white identifier are European countries. All of the countries that are under the Black category are African countries and one or two English-speaking Caribbean countries. Right now, they say that this is just done based on strictly the number, the population number within the country, right, as represented by nationality. However, what it does is that if someone is looking at the census form, that is a signal, right? And the signal is saying that, if you're white, you can only be from these countries. If you're Black, you can only be from these countries. So, to understandably, there's a lot of Latinos in general who don't see themselves, but there's a whole hemisphere essentially that they've ignored. And that in and of itself, to me, when you're talking about Latin America and the Hispanic Latino question, juxtaposed with those changes, it doesn't show the understanding that one would want from them in making these kinds of changes. It shows that there's an understanding as to really how race and ethnicity are perceived in Latino communities, Latino racial ideology, how that exists in respective countries, but it also exists here in the United States amongst U.S. Latinos and those who arrive. It doesn't take a lot of these things into account. So one of the main things that the coalition is asking for is one, to be able to allow for additional testing, to allow for experts, Afro-Latino experts and academics who are well trained in this, and not just in sociological race, ethnography, and statistical analysis, but in understanding Latino racial ideology and how that works. Mm-hmm. Having them at the table, because that has not been the case. In a substantive manner, and just a general reassessment of the format in which some of the questions are asked. I mentioned this kind of unintentional, I would give the benefit of the doubt of saying, signaling of equating race and nationality.
Unintentional, maybe. Irma, let me bring you back in, Dr. Irma. The question of data. And I think that we have learned over the years to be suspicious of research on the one hand, but we also are learning that we have to use research and data to our own advantage. So in this question of the census, how, as Amilcar said, the potential for it to invisibilize Afro-Latinos, how do we both acknowledge and guard against it? And at the same time, how do we ensure that we mine the data differently for ourselves, but also put ourselves in position to craft how the data will be handled, to design, as Brother Priestley has said, the questions and the approach, so that it more accurately reflects what we perceive to be our reality and our interest. Talk about whose interests are being served with the invisibilization of the African in the Latino world.
Let me just say first that I've worked for the federal government, okay? And I came out of the Office of Personnel Management, and I've seen the way in which websites are designed and sort of data is collected. And unfortunately, it's always a reductionist, that there's always a move to simplify, not for the people, but for the people who are actually processing the data. So often websites and categories are not really about defining and helping us to clarify things, but really it's about how do we simplify the work for the people who are coding this material into the computer. So that's one thing, is that it's often very functional. And because of that, it tends to be binary. They want something that is either this or that. You're either black or you're white, right? And they really have a difficult time in these sort of nuances that Amilcar pointed to. I think the solutions that he offered to one, like put a pause on this until there is more conversation, more inclusion of people who actually are part of those categories involved, because it seems like on the one hand, where they want to just collapse Hispanic and Latinos into this sort of amorphous group that's neither this or that, they are disaggregating the Middle Easterners into a separate group. They're no longer homogenized into whiteness. They now get their separate categories. So they actually were able to petition for that and advocate for that. So it seems to me that the advocacy part of it, and having people say, no, we need to pause this, leave it as it is until we can clarify it better, because at least Afro-Latinos don't get erased in the current way. And you also can account for the fact that, hey, there are Asian people, people of Asian descent in Latin America. You know, there are indigenous people in Latin America. You know, the presentation that we often see, because we have DeSantis and we have, you know, Mark Rubio, you know, these are sort of people of white Cuban descent, or people who perceive themselves as white Cubans, who present themselves as white. And so the world tends to think, because, you know, Latino television hasn't been, you know, hasn't been that good about presenting Black faces until more recently. People tend to think of Latin America as white countries, right? And I think we also have to understand, we're not talking about a group of people who share, the only thing they share is language. They come from different countries with different histories, with different cultural backgrounds, with different mixtures of,
and for different reasons.
and for different reasons.
Yeah.
And so this collapsing is often just very functional. And it's almost like the people who are doing the, you know, it's the bean counters. The bean counters need an easy way to sort the beans, and doing it this way makes it easier for their job, but then it creates a lot of confusion.
Well, so from within the culture, Amilcar, what is it that we want? What do we need from within the culture of Afro-descendants? What will be the optimum strategy and systems and process for participation in developing, you know, data that really serves everybody better?
I mean, I think it's a twofold question. So one part is participation in these processes, right? Not being invited last minute to the conversation, keeping the conversations relevant and contemporary, and then also there is a need for the resources to educate within our own communities, right? Like, you know, one of the things that folks, you know, and some of the legacy Latino organizations who have been pushing this, NALEO and some of these other organizations, and we've spoken to some of them. We've attended several convenings with several civil rights organizations who are many of who are supportive, some of who are supportive of the changes, and others who have supported our position, including, for example, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund. But the changes have to the conversation has been, oh, well, you know, there's been a lot of progress in the last 10 years, and there has been a lot of progress, right? And when we say, you know, we've been part of this community, we've been helping to foster this community within the United States, and been part of this community regionally and globally, and there's a movement in a positive direction, and the concern is that this will undermine that, right? But because that movement, sure, it came from a lot of the work, the sweat, the tears, but a lot of it was educating the community. But a lot of that came from, you know, with little resources from because we had to, right? A lot of folks who are doing this, you know, do this because this is our lived experience. This is what I call a sociological imperative. Like, we don't have a choice. And so, you know, where are those resources going to come from? How is the implementation of these changes going to go about? How are the communities going to be educated? Because, if Black and Latino organizations generally aren't getting the resources that they need, then when you get even more granularly and you talk about Afro-Latino organizations, then you fall even further into the cracks, right? But at the end of the day, you are talking about, according to Pew, you know, something to the tune of 6 million people in the United States, right? And so it's something that it should not be kind of so easily, especially now, fall into this binary. You know, I mean, if the push is to expand the way the census captures data to reflect the ways in which the United States currently views itself, then, you know, they're missing a few points here.
Let me
And
ask you.
could I just
Go ahead.
add that I think it's important for us to understand what is the census about? It's not just documenting the number of people in the population of this country. It is also a way in which resources are allocated. So if you don't differentiate and disaggregate the communities, let's take Miami, which is mostly, I mean, we tend to think of it, that's where most of the white Cubans went, right? So if you're just looking at an amorphous category, then it means that the smaller communities within Hispanics don't get the allocation of resources. It goes to those groups where they have majorities, and it's not going to get disseminated or dispersed in the way that we would want to think about it. So the census is not just about bean counting and the number of bodies or peoples in the population. It is also about where do resources get allocated and to
Mhm.
who are those, or to whom are those resources allocated as well.
Absolutely, and it's about enforcement, right? It's, I mean, part of that is about enforcement of equal protection laws, enforcement of civil rights laws, and so, taking the example that Dr. McClaurin gave, you have an instance of, and one of the coalition experts is Dr. Tanya Hernandez. Another one is Dr. Nancy Lopez, and they've written extensively on this. So I would invite everyone to read some of their work, and they've been published recently in the New Yorker, and a number of other places. But they basically have made clear that when you're looking at at the actual tangible effect of this conflation, of this proposal, what you lose is the ability to assess, for example, in Miami, in a housing discrimination case where there is a Black Cuban who's claiming he's been discriminated against by a white Cuban. And, it makes it that much harder to raise a claim because there isn't really a regime for intra-ethnic discrimination or intra-racial discrimination, right? And so, by conflating these terms, you are now, in essence, removing some of the legal protections that folks have. And they'll say, well, there's other remedies, but in essence, you're making it that much harder. And that coupled with the ways in which this affects resources, those are two huge impacts.
Let's talk about the demographics in this country, the Afro-Latino population. Describe it, if you would, Brother Amilcar, because I think that too often we don't take the time to examine ourselves, who we are, and our culture, our community at large doesn't take the time to look at the component nature of our being together, but it really is a strength and an asset, and it is real. So, how do you describe the Afro-Latino world in United States, first of all? But let's talk about the entire Western Hemisphere beyond that, because I think that the two things happen. One is that we're not trained to see it internally here, and we're even less trained to acknowledge the phenomenally large presence of Africans throughout the Caribbean and South America as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I ascribed to the term Afro-descendant in much the same vein. I kind of use them interchangeably in that Afro-Latinos are people of African descent from Latin America or the Caribbean or of this descendants thereof. And in the United States, so there's, in the region, in the Western Hemisphere, there's about 1/3 of the population of the Americas, of the Central and South America, are Afro-descendant. So it's about 125 million people. Not a small amount. And unfortunately, historically and contemporarily, we continue to be marginalized. We've made progress, but that continues, as Irma mentioned, in not just in public policy, but in media and etc. But that is who the U.S. Latino population could basically derive from. The U.S. Afro-Latino population, U.S. Afro-Latino population. The U.S. Afro-Latino population is concentrated most heavily on the East Coast. Some in the Midwest, in Chicago, Houston, but heavily East Coast, specifically the Northeast region, New York up to Boston. And I think the country by country, I think predominantly Dominican, Puerto Rican, and then Haitian, Colombian, and then it kind of trickles down from there. But according to Pew, again, there are 6 million self-identified Afro-Latinos in the U.S. And so what's interesting, and we can get into that, if there's time, is that some of those Afro-Latinos, even though they marked Afro-Latino, they some chose race white, some chose race black, and it's and part of even that, and being able to understand what that is, it goes a long way to making the appropriate design implementation to the census.
Why would they choose white? Why would they choose black?
I mean, if you see Afro-Latino, and this is what we've learned, or what has been discussed, as far as those results. Oftentimes when you see Afro-Latino, some folks choose white because that is how they present. Now they might be Afro-Latino, African descent, and that is an option, so they chose that, but they chose white. Others choose white because it's beneficial, right? When you're looking at people have this perception when you come to the United States that if you choose white, you're not going to be treated. You're going to be treated okay, right? And so that is the beneficiary kind of perception that folks have.
White skin privilege.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then some folks who affirmatively choose black because there has been no question for them as to whether they're black. They present as black. They identify as black wherever they go, or whatever border they are, on whatever side of the border they're on. And so there's never been an issue of that. So there's as with all people of the African diaspora, we come in all shades, right? Mm-hmm. We come in all permutations. The ways in which those of us who are lighter or darker have benefited or suffered aren't that distinct, regardless of where we are or what language we speak. And there are nuances that have to be acknowledged and respected, and differences. That is of importance. You don't want to facilitate erasure by conflating even all black folk, but there are real commonalities that I know as a diaspora it would be beneficial for us to really be pushing a better understanding of.
Irma, what do you see as movement for African people in the Western Hemisphere? I think Amilcar mentioned, the progress signaled by President Lula and his vice president, and the new vice president, not new, but relatively new vice president in Costa Rica. Where do you see us going? Because my sense is that for the longest we were and continue to experience marginalization and had our voices suppressed. And the official story is that we were comfortable being marginalized and suppressed because we were not seen or heard in the media. But I know that cannot be true. Where do you see us going now? Because digital technology means we can connect differently and without having to be filtered as much as in the past by colonial interests and voices. Where do we go from here, Irma? Dr. Irma?
Boy, that's a big question, right? And do you mean in the context of
Afro-descendant is African
Afro-descendant?
descended people
I mean,
in
what
the
I'm
hemisphere.
right, and what Amilcar has pointed to is that many countries are now beginning to include that in the categories. I
Mhm.
think he was talking about the fact that Panama now has a designation. For many decades, people did not want to have Black as a category in their census. So you could be anything but. So I think the assertion of Afro-Latino voices and their advocacy has been is visible in the way in which we're seeing them have political results in a way that we saw back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but we're actually losing momentum now. Uh, and so, for example, I am right here, in Mobile, Alabama, and there is now a question about annexation. Mobile is actually a majority Black town, but if they annex to one district, one segment, it will become 50-50. If they annex to a separate one, another one, which does not bring in as much revenue, it will still retain its majority Black. Now, what's interesting is that the movement is towards the second one so that it will retain its historically majority Black presence. But now you have the white media saying, well, if we tried to do that for white people, we would be getting so much critique. But the reality is that's what they have been doing,
That's what they always
is to
do.
try and
Sure.
redistrict to make
Yeah.
it so that it is majority white. So I think that we're losing ground at a moment when Afro-descendants in Latin America are trying to galvanize and gain ground. And I think it's a push-pull kind of thing. We just have to keep pushing, but we also have to support and understand that their struggle is somewhat different from ours, but we still need to support them in the same way that many have supported us, not only contemporarily, but historically.
Michelle Madison is a regular viewer of the program. She asked in the chat, how important is it to obtain dual citizenship when you are a direct descendant of a parent from another country? She says her mother's parents were born in the Caribbean and that she has citizenship in both countries. Amilcar, how important is it to keep that dual citizenship alive?
I mean, it depends. I think for a lot of folks, I think it's a generational thing. I think for a lot of folks, it was very important to keep the connections back home. It has been very important to keep the connections back home. You see in a lot of communities, immigrant communities, there's remittances are particularly high because folks have that close connection, and dual citizenship is one way to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, one of the questions, curiosities that I found with regard to this conversation and the census is that the group with the second highest, or one of the highest rates of marking some other race on the census is actually West Indians, Afro-Caribbean folks, and they put it through the same thing. They put in their country of origin, and how does that census? How statistically it might not be the large numerical number with respect to the Hispanic population, but it's interesting to know that it's also an issue within the Caribbean community as well.
And in that community, you have people who are mixed with African, Asian,
Exactly.
Southeast Asian, so you have Chinese, you have
Lebanese,
you have
Syrian,
Lebanese,
yeah.
Syrian. And so, part of it is that by definition, Black Americans also have been hybrid. I mean, if you go back to the rape of Black women on the slave ship, this hair did not come from Africa. Okay. So there's always been some kind of mixture. What we've paid attention to is the more contemporary mixture where you have a person of African descent marry someone who's white or Latino, and then sort of we talk about that. So we don't look at the history of that. We're all in some ways this amalgamation of many different groups of people from Africa, because there was intentionality and not putting people from the same, tribe or country together so that they could not speak the same language, so that they could not organize resistance, even though it did occur. And that's where Creole languages came. People had to create a different kind of language to communicate across the differences. We sometimes treat Africa even as if it were a country when it's a continent made up of multiple countries. And I think our challenge is that there is a resurgency of white supremacy that is so evident. And that when you hear, particularly in the United States, when you hear political messages like, let's make America great again, or something, it is really a nod to a past where Black people knew their places, where women sort of knew their places. And I just had this conversation with my uncle who's 83, and he says, we can't go back. We will never go back to those moments. But whites are really trying to assert themselves. And I think what we're going to see is a large influx of Ukrainian immigrants, because they're going to be treated, because they're white skin, they're going to be treated and given special privileges in ways that Haitians and other people from Mexico and other countries are not. And I think that is a real challenge for us.
Speaking about Haiti, I was reading an interview, or watching an interview with Jacob Carruthers. It was a 2004 presentation to the Society of African Civilization. That's not the proper name of the organization, but he talked about the Haitian Revolution being the most significant political and military event in the history of the West, and that even more significant, more important than the U.S. Revolutionary War and others throughout the hemisphere. Any thoughts about Haiti's successful bid for freedom, and how that resonates and appears today in our individual and collective cultures throughout the diaspora? Dr. Irma or Amilcar, either one, care to respond to that? And where I'm going is, how do we sort of use all the knowledge available to us now with the new energy? Irma, you said that we've regressed in some ways. How do we turn that around? We have enough data and enough opportunity to do things differently, I believe. What do you think, Amilcar?
I mean, we're in an age of disinformation. So, unfortunately, we have to constantly. This is when you think that you can take a step back, you have to keep it up, and it can be exhausting. So I think that's one thing. We do have to combat these things where we meet them. One thing with Haiti, I mean, I think it's, the reaction to the Haitian Revolution was basically the same throughout the Western Hemisphere, regardless of what language was spoken, right? Like the English speaking colonizers in North America were as terrified as the Spanish speaking colonizers and the French and the Dutch in the rest of the Americas, right? You have Simon Bolivar, who was hailed as the great liberator of South America, who had to go basically hand in hand to Alexander Pétion for support. He was who, at the behest of Alexander Pétion, saying, if we supply you with weapons and arms, and you have to free the slaves, you have to free your slaves, and that is basically how South America was liberated. Now, that also impacted essentially how people gained their freedom, right? Because a lot of folks were able to gain their freedom during that time by fighting in the war. It affected how the racial hierarchy was created, right? Because that was what you call I think there was a term at one point, the mulatto escape hatch. Well, this is kind of a military escape hatch, and that is something that I think has existed not just in Latin America, but even here, as the military serves as an opportunity for Black Americans to escape, certain conditions. And there's benefits and there's detriments, right? You're fighting for your country, but your country is not fighting for you necessarily.
And I would just simply add that you asked sort of what are our options? What can we do?
Mm-hmm.
I think we have a responsibility to keep supporting things like Black newspapers, because we're having information in schools. We don't have much control over what kids are going to be seen or not. I think archiving the work and the kind of digital archiving that Amilcar is doing with the Afro-Latino Project. He has a series called Conversaciones Afro, in which people talk about what it means to be Black in Latin America. I think we in the United States, who are people of African descendants of enslaved people, we need to pay attention to that history. It's somewhat different from ours. And so we need to understand it and not do a comparison, but really just try and understand it. And I think we have a responsibility to go back to some like the New Africa schools, where kids used to get after school and Saturday programs where they could learn about what is going on. My niece has twins who are now like 4 years old. And I have made it my mission to send them books about Black history, Native American history, Latino history, so that as they grow up with a knowledge base that is broader than, just sort of what they see every day. And since they live in white Minnesota, that's my goal.
Amilcar, in the last minute here, what can people still do to both be aware and to raise voice around the question of the census?
Yeah, thank you. So the census the Office of Management and Budget extended the deadline for public comments. So public comments can be made at the Federal Registrar website. If you go to the coalition website, latinoisnotarace.info, latinoisnotarace.info, there are links there to the OMB site to leave public comments. There's also draft letters and additional resources and information on some of the concerns as well as some of the proposed alternatives. So again, that is latinoisnotarace.info, and public comments are open until
when?
April 27th.
Okay.
So that's this Thursday.
A couple of days. Okay.
So
Great.
we encourage everyone to go in there and make a comment and let your voice be heard. When we started the campaign, there were very few comments, and it's grown exponentially as we've kind of worked tirelessly. The coalition.
And what do you want people to say, Amilcar? Should they say, no, Latino is not a race? I mean, what are the kinds of things?
Well, there's sample, like folks don't even have to come up with their own comments, right? Like
Okay.
we've created the coalition has a template of any number of comments that you can add, from one line to a whole letter.
Okay.
And so that's all on the latinoisnotarace.info website. We try to make it as clear and as simple as possible.
We're out of time. Listen, thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. I'm McFarlane.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you again.
Yes.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.